Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution on North Korea human rights for 16 years in a row. The United Nations Security Council brought up the issue of human rights abuses in North Korea in a closed-door meeting. Meanwhile, the United States is raising its voice on North Korea's human rights issues. VOA confirmed that a U.S. Congressional Bipartisan Commission on Human Rights will hold a hearing in January over South Korea's recent passage of a bill banning anti-Pyongyang leaflets. We'll discuss these and more. Joining us is Robert King. He served as United States Special Envoy for North Korea human rights issues for nearly 8 years, from 2009 to 2017. Andrew Yeol also joins us today. He's professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He's currently in the Philippines to conduct his research. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Members of the United Nations Security Council discussed the issue of the North Korean regime's human rights abuses in a closed-door virtual meeting. Although the issue wasn't discussed as a formal topic due to the opposition from China, it was the first time in 3 years that the North Korean human rights issue was raised in the Security Council. Ambassador Kim, what was the significance of the meeting held this year?
The real significance is that the United States was involved with the Security Council discussion for the first time in 3 years. In 2017, with the leadership of the United States, and I want to hasten to add that that was under the leadership of President Trump. It was a very useful discussion. It was important to have that. We didn't have it for the next 3 years, and the United States blocked the consideration. The United States actually prevented it from happening in 2019, and so this represents a significant improvement. Now, the question is whether that's simply because we're not making progress on talks with North Korea, or whether there's something more to it. It may well be simply that the president has disengaged from dealing with foreign policy and most other issues because of his concerns about losing the election and trying to cope with his disappointment over that. But I think it's noteworthy, I think it's significant, and I welcome it.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Yeol?
Yes, Ambassador King raised some interesting points, but momentum had unfortunately been lost at the UN Security Council on North Korean human rights after the US and UN engaged in high-level summitry. But hopefully the resumption of North Korean human rights on the agenda isn't a signal that human rights only matters when nuclear negotiations stall. More optimistically, discussion at the UN Security Council coincides with the election of a new US administration that may address North Korean human rights in a more consistent manner in broad international forums such as the United Nations.
As Ambassador King pointed out, last year the United States opposed to the idea of the UN Security Council holding a meeting on the North Korean human rights issue. Why did the US stance change this year, Professor Yeol? Was it because of the symmetry?
Well, last year there was hope for some type of diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and North Korea. I remember then Special Representative North Korea, Steve Biegun, visiting Seoul in mid-December last year in the hopes of persuading North Korea to resume talks after the North Koreans walked away from working level discussions in October. This year, the United States really has nothing to lose in addressing North Korean human rights. So that may be just one of the reasons why the US decided to bring it back up at the UN Security Council.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador King, did the US change its stance because there was no progress in the talks with North Korea?
I think that's one of the factors that was involved, yes. The United States has been willing to use human rights as in a transactional way in dealing with North Korea, and the fact that there's been no progress is certainly a reason for the United States to allow the human rights issues to come up.
Ambassador, with the new Biden administration coming in, shall we expect a similar stance from the U.S. going forward on the human rights issue in North Korea?
Oh, yeah. My sense is that North Korea is an issue that we're going to see more similarities to the policies that were followed in the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration. I think there's going to be a more targeted approach to try to deal with security issues. I think human rights will be given more attention. It'll no longer be used in the transactional way that the Trump administration has done. My sense is that there's going to be a lot more continuity with what has happened in the past.
Professor Yeo, do you think the Biden administration's approach on North Korean human rights different from the Trump administration?
Well, before I begin, let me just say that the United States, and particularly the State Department, has often led the charge in addressing North Korean human rights issues. And this has been true for even under the Trump administration. But the White House under Trump has not been that consistent with its messaging on North Korean human rights, dealing with the issue in an instrumental way, as Ambassador King pointed out. I expect the Biden administration to follow a more principled approach to human rights. President-elect Biden was personally engaged with North Korean human rights and humanitarian issues as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I expect the issue will become a higher priority for his administration.
Mm-hmm. And many human rights groups are calling for the early appointment of the special envoy for human rights in North Korea. Professor Yeo, why is this important?
Well, there's no better person to speak about that than the former special envoy, but since you pitched the question to me first, an early appointment sends a clear message to the international community, including the North Koreans, that human rights in North Korea remains an important issue for the United States government. The position had remained unfilled during the entirety of the Trump administration, despite a congressional mandate for a designated appointment of this human rights envoy. If the Biden administration wants to strengthen its credibility in arguing that human rights and democracy are important on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere, they'll need to set an early precedent. Filling the special envoy position will signal a greater degree of institutional commitment to the issue and provide some assurance that North Korean human rights won't be approached in a perfunctory way. And just lastly, as a practical matter, fulfilling the special envoy position early will increase the United States government's capacity to address the serious humanitarian crisis that may be unfolding due to COVID-19 and strict border lockdowns. Although the former special representative to North Korea, Steve Biegun, and now Deputy Special Representative Alex Wong have managed to handle a wide range of issues, from nuclear diplomacy to sanctions to human rights, they have been incredibly overstretched. The special envoy position will help ease the burden and allow the United States to devote more time and attention to human rights and human security issues.
Right. Ambassador King, as Professor Yeo said, you served long as the special envoy for human rights in North Korea. Could you tell us about what you did as the special envoy? And what were the most important topics you dealt with back then?
Let me make one quick comment about the timing on the appointment of special envoy. It takes a while for an administration to appoint individuals for various offices, and it's particularly difficult when it requires Senate confirmation. The State Department has 225 positions that require Senate confirmations. All ambassadors, for example, require Senate confirmation. It's going to take the administration a while to get those individuals nominated, to have background investigations conducted on all of these people, and then to get it to the Senate and get the Senate to act on these provisions. When I was appointed special envoy in 2009, my appointment was one of the earlier appointments in the Obama administration, and I was not sworn in until the end of November. So, yes, I think Biden administration is going to make progress. They will make appointments, including the appointment for the North Korea human rights portfolio, but it's not going to happen by April. We're talking fall at the earliest. I don't think we should judge that as the basis of their commitment on the human rights issues. But the issues that need to be dealt with are many. There are a number of areas where we need focus and attention. One of them is in the United Nations. The U.S. is no longer participating in the UN Human Rights Council. I think one of the things the administration will probably do, and I certainly hope they do, is to involve the United States again in the activities of the UN Human Rights Council. The Trump administration withdrew from participation. We also need to take steps in terms of dealing with humanitarian aid. I was involved in negotiations with North Korea on humanitarian aid. I was also involved in working with a number of private groups who were involved in providing humanitarian aid. We need to revive that effort, and we need to make it easier for people involved in humanitarian aid to get U.S. visas to go into North Korea. The other two issues involve North Koreans defecting, leaving North Korea. We need to continue to provide assistance and help for those who wish to come to the United States, but also to help those who are involved in trying to go to other countries. And those are the main issues of concern, I think, that the special envoy will have to deal with. That is primarily making sure that a human rights component is part of U.S. policy towards North Korea.
Mm. Meanwhile, South Korea's parliament passed a bill banning anti-Pyongyang leaflets. There are worries this move could hurt democratic values in South Korea, such as freedom of speech. And according to the Washington Post, Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun had privately conveyed the U.S. government's concerns during his recent visit to Seoul. Do you share similar concerns, Professor Yeo?
Let me just begin by saying that this has become a very politicized issue that may go beyond just the issue of freedom of speech. However, it's not just about this particular bill that's concerning when it comes to limitations of freedom of speech. The South Korean government has defended its decision to restrict sending leaflets into North Korea on the grounds of national security, such as protecting the residents that live near the border areas in the city of Paju, and also de-escalating tensions with North Koreans. That's all fine. But when this bill is taken in conjunction with other actions, such as the funding of North Korean defector-run human rights organizations, or establishing investigations which target defector-led human rights organizations, or preventing defector journalists from attending events relevant to their area of news coverage out of fear that they may offend North Korea, this does begin to look like an infringement on the rights of a particular group. A broader concern here is whether the actions of the South Korean government run contrary to liberal democracy. If North Korean defectors, even those who have active political agendas, are treated as a group with minority status, then one might argue that their right to send information and advocate on behalf of North Korean human rights should be permitted.
Ambassador King, do you have anything to add to this?
I'm convinced that there's not a lot of value to sending information by balloon. You can't control where it goes. It's haphazard as to who it reaches. But at the same time, this is not just an issue about freedom of information. This has become a political issue in South Korea. And unfortunately, that's the context in which it's playing out. The South Koreans are seen, the current South Korean government, the majority in the parliament, are seen as doing what the North wants. The North has issued threats. The South Korean government is responding by doing what the North wants to do. I think this is not a positive way to move forward in terms of any kind of relationship with North Korea. I think it's related in many regards to the fact that President Moon only has another year or so before his term expires. And he's anxious to do something with North Korea. And so the South is bending over backwards to do anything that will placate the North. Unfortunately, it's had a very negative reaction in the United States. The U.S. Congress, several members of Congress have spoken out. You mentioned the hearing that is going to take place next month. This is not a good situation in terms of U.S. relations with South Korea. And that's an important relationship that both sides need to cultivate. And the North Korean government needs to be sensitive to how this is playing in the United States. South Korea is coming out looking very bad in the United States because of its actions. It's seen as totally responding to the North Korean demands, and it's not a happy situation in terms of U.S. support for South Korea.
As Ambassador King said, the U.S. sees the importance of the outside information getting into North Korea. Professor Yeo, does the recent passage of the bill in South Korea show that the South Korean government has a different view on the external information going into North Korea?
Yes, in principle, I assume the South Korean government also endeavors for North Koreans to have more access to information from the outside world, but that shouldn't be at the expense of jeopardizing inter-Korea relations. That's where I think the United States and South Korea diverge, as the State Department has no qualms bringing information to North Korea that they themselves have been barred from freely accessing. This has been consistent practice since the Cold War, where the U.S. endeavored to bring information to people deprived of any other news source other than their own government's propaganda. So while the United States has continued to support such information campaigns, the Trump administration hasn't been very vocal about North Korean human rights issues. So I assume that might be the reason why they haven't pushed the issue with their South Korean counterparts. But if the Biden administration elevates human rights and tries to coordinate its policy on North Korean human rights, including access to information with its South Korean allies, I think they can move forward with this. But as Ambassador King said, I really think that this is really setting up to be a bad situation, given the strong reaction that we've seen so far from the United States, especially in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador King, just to follow up on this. So if U.S. and South Korea do not see eye to eye on this issue, will it become a hurdle in the future U.S.-South Korea cooperation in dealing with North Korea?
My sense is that with a Biden administration, there's going to be more focus, more attention on improving the relationship between the United States and South Korea. I think some of the negotiations that have been going on with regard to stationing of U.S. troops in South Korea have been very poorly handled by the Trump administration. I think the Biden administration will be much more sensitive about what it does and how it goes about its foreign policy activities with South Korea. The relationship between the United States and South Korea is an extremely important one for both countries. It's one that has very strong roots in the United States based on our involvement in the war, in the Korean War. And that's a relationship that we need to cultivate, and we need to make sure we strengthen that relationship, not that we handle it the way the Trump administration has poorly handled it.
Mm-hmm. But Ambassador, it seems like the South Korean government and the ruling party believe that this ban could help improve the inter-Korean relations. Will it really help?
I'm not sure that it will. I don't think it's a major source of information. The question is whether North Korea is going to put pressure on South Korea to stop radio broadcasts. There are South Korean radio broadcasts that go into North Korea. They're quite popular, and they're listened to. They're heard by many North Koreans, in spite of the fact that it's illegal to listen to South Korean radio in North Korea. So I think that the North is not going to be placated by concessions from the South on this particular issue. I think it will only embolden the North to press South Korea on other issues. The North is insatiable in terms of pressure.
Professor Yeo, you mentioned earlier a little bit about this, but will this help inter-Korean relations?
In terms of helping inter-Korea relations, not really. As we've seen, North Korea will follow its own agenda and rules. We haven't seen North Korea exactly warming up to the Moon government's outreach for even things like humanitarian support. So just because the South Koreans have capitulated and they've agreed to stop sending leaflets, it doesn't mean necessarily that the North Koreans are going to move ahead with inter-Korea relations, because we just haven't seen any evidence for that yet.
And my last question is for Professor Yeo. How do you suggest the U.S. deal with this issue?
Well, so there's going to have to be dialogue and discussion between counterparts in South Korea and the U.S. We've seen National Assemblyman Ji Sung-ho come to meet with different individuals in the United States in in Congress as well. But perhaps there can be some dialogue among legislators. Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa has already explained the South Korea position, but it doesn't look like the United States side is buying it. So really, it's going to have to be, they're just going to have to dialogue and discuss where they see differences and find a way to coordinate on this issue. I think both sides would rather just have this issue go away, but we've seen in South Korea the issue becoming heavily politicized as well too. So unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case. But again, it's going back to dialogue between two sides and trying to figure out some sort of middle ground.
The international community continues to voice its concerns over South Korea's ban of sending leaflets that criticize the North Korean regime. And we'll have to keep an eye on how this will play out. Ambassador King and Professor Ya, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here on your program.
Thank you. And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.